The son's judgment. With two Diep standing silently by his side, James faced his ailing father, no longer as a child seeking approval, but as a man shaped by love, loss, and hard truths. The room was heavy with unspoken pain, every breath carrying years of misunderstanding and sacrifice. In that fragile moment, James was torn between resentment and compassion, forced to confront the past while deciding what kind of son and what kind of man he would be. Sometimes judgment is not about blame, but about finding the courage to forgive.
The phone rang on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of day that passes quietly without leaving a mark. Yet, with a single sentence, "Your father is seriously ill," James felt the ground beneath his life shift. Some news does not arrive loudly. It sinks in slowly, like rain into dry soil, heavy and unavoidable. For years, James had learned how to live without looking back. He buried memories under work, distance, and silence. But illness has a way of reopening doors we swear we have locked forever. The old house stood at the edge of the town, unchanged, as if time itself had chosen to avoid it. The paint was fading, the gate slightly crooked, and the air carried the scent of dust and fallen leaves. James stopped at the entrance, his feet refusing to move forward. This was not just a place. It was a collection of wounds, raised voices, and decisions made without mercy. He wondered whether returning meant weakness or courage disguised as obligation. Beside him, two Diep did not speak. She understood that some battles are fought in silence. Her presence was calm, steady, like a quiet hand resting on a trembling shoulder. She did not ask him to forgive. She did not urge him to forget. She simply stayed. And sometimes that is the bravest kind of love, walking beside someone, even when the path leads back into pain.
James remembered the man his father used to be, tall, commanding, feared more than loved. A man who believed that strength was built through pressure and affection was a luxury that softened men into failure. Growing up, James learned discipline before tenderness, obedience before understanding. Every choice had been judged, every emotion questioned. Leaving home had felt like escape, but also like betrayal. As the door slowly opened, James's heart beat faster, not from fear of what he would see, but from fear of what he might feel. Was he here to accuse, to demand answers, or simply to see the man who once shaped his life, now weakened by time? He did not know, and perhaps that uncertainty was the heaviest burden of all. Inside the house, silence waited, and so did a question that lingered in the air, unspoken yet powerful. When a father falls, does a son have the right to judge or the responsibility to understand?
The room was dim, lit only by the pale afternoon light slipping through half-closed curtains. James stepped inside slowly, as if afraid that a single careless movement might shatter something fragile and unseen. On the bed lay his father, no longer the towering figure of his childhood, but a frail man wrapped in thin blankets, his breathing uneven, his face marked by time and regret. The sight struck James harder than any harsh word ever had. For a moment he stood frozen. Memories rose uninvited, nights spent studying under pressure, dreams dismissed as childish, love disguised as control. His father had never known how to say "I care." Instead, he had spoken through rules, punishment, and impossible expectations. Looking at the man now, James felt anger and pity intertwine, creating a knot in his chest that refused to loosen. Diep remained near the doorway, respectful yet attentive. She observed quietly, her eyes soft with empathy. She had heard the stories, felt the consequences of this broken bond, and yet she chose not to judge. In that moment, James realized how different her love was, gentle, patient, free of fear. It made him wonder how different his life might have been if kindness had guided him instead of pressure. His father stirred, eyelids fluttering open. Their eyes met, and silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken words. The man's voice, once firm and commanding, now trembled like a leaf in the wind. "You came," he whispered, as if surprised by his own hope. James wanted to respond, but his voice failed him. What could he say that would not reopen old wounds? Instead, he noticed his father's hands, thin, trembling, no longer capable of holding the weight of control. Time had stripped the man of his power, leaving behind only what truly mattered. And in that quiet realization, James felt something shift inside him. Perhaps strength was not about domination after all. Perhaps true strength was the courage to face one's mistakes. As Diep stepped forward to adjust the blanket, her simple gesture filled the room with warmth. She was not there to demand justice, but to remind them both of something easily forgotten in a lifetime of conflict, that understanding often begins when judgment pauses. And in that fragile space between past and present, the possibility of reconciliation quietly took root. Rain began to fall outside the hospital window, slow and steady, like the ticking of an invisible clock. Each drop echoed the silence in the room, a silence so heavy it pressed against James's chest. He pulled a chair closer to the bed and finally sat down. This small act, so ordinary in daily life, felt monumental, as if crossing an unseen line he had avoided for years. His father watched him closely, eyes clouded with illness, yet sharp with awareness. "You look tired," the old man said softly. The words were simple, almost meaningless, but they struck James deeply. No one had ever asked him that before, not his father. For a brief second, James saw not the tyrant of his past, but a man who had spent his life hiding fear behind authority. "I am," James replied. His voice was calm, but inside, storms collided. "I've been tired for a long time." The confession surprised even himself. Once spoken, the words flowed like a river finally freed from a dam. He spoke of sleepless nights, of carrying expectations that never felt like his own, of loving someone and being forced to choose between love and obedience. Every sentence rose and fell, sometimes sharp with pain, sometimes quiet with sadness.
Diep stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. That touch grounded him, reminding him of everyday moments, shared meals, silent walks, the comfort of being understood without explanation. It was the kind of support people rarely notice until they are on the brink of collapse. Through her presence, James found the courage to continue. His father closed his eyes, listening. When he spoke again, his voice cracked. "I thought hardship would make you strong," he said. "I was afraid the world would break you if I didn't." Tears slipped down his temples, disappearing into the pillow. "I didn't know I was the one hurting you." Those words changed the air in the room. James felt anger dissolve into something heavier but softer, grief for all the years lost to misunderstanding. He realized how often in everyday life people wound each other not out of cruelty but fear. Parents fear losing their children. Children fear never being enough. And between those fears, love becomes distorted. James inhaled deeply. "I didn't need you to control my life," he said gently. "I needed you to trust me." The rain outside intensified, then slowly eased, as if echoing the release within him. For the first time, father and son faced each other, not as judge and defendant, but as two flawed human beings, standing at the edge of forgiveness. Morning light crept softly into the hospital room, pale and hesitant, as if unsure whether it was welcome. The night had passed without certainty, only breathing, quiet prayers, and the fragile rhythm of machines. James had not slept. He sat by the window, watching the city awaken, people rushing to work, carrying bags, worries and hopes that looked strangely familiar. Life outside moved on, indifferent, while inside the room, everything felt suspended. His father stirred. When he opened his eyes, they searched the room, then settled on James. There was no command in that gaze now, only a quiet plea. Slowly, with effort, the old man reached out. James hesitated, 1,000 memories flashing through his mind, harsh words, closed doors, long silences. Yet he stood and took that trembling hand.
It was thinner than he remembered, weaker, almost fragile. In that moment, James understood how time humbles even the strongest. "I don't have much time," his father whispered, "but I don't want to leave with regret." His grip tightened slightly. "I pushed you away because I feared losing you. I thought distance would protect you. I was wrong." The confession hung in the air, raw and unpolished, like truth often is.
Diep stepped forward, her voice gentle but steady. "Love doesn't grow in fear," she said. "It grows when we allow each other to choose." Her words were not an accusation, but an offering. The old man looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and nodded slowly. In her calm strength, he saw what he had once mistaken for weakness. James felt something loosen inside him. Forgiveness did not arrive like a sudden miracle. It came quietly, like dawn after a long night. He realized that forgiving his father did not erase the past, but it freed the future. In everyday life, people often wait for perfect apologies, perfect timing. Yet life rarely grants such moments. Sometimes all we receive is sincerity, and it must be enough. When the doctor entered, the room returned to reality. Instructions were given, futures remained uncertain. But something fundamental had shifted. As they prepared to leave, James leaned down and embraced his father. It was awkward, unfamiliar, but real. The old man closed his eyes, tears escaping without shame. Walking out of the hospital, Diep intertwined her fingers with James's. The air felt lighter, though questions still lingered. Would healing last? Would the past resurface? They did not know, but they had chosen to face it together. And sometimes that choice, to stay, to forgive, to hold on without control, is the bravest judgment a son can make.
From James's journey, we learn that life rarely presents us with clear answers or perfect choices. Instead, it places us at crossroads where every direction carries pain, responsibility, and hope at the same time. One of the deepest lessons in this story is that love, when mixed with fear, can turn into control. James's father loved his son deeply, yet his fear of losing him led him to create distance, obstacles, and suffering. This reminds us that good intentions do not always lead to good actions, especially when we allow fear to guide our decisions. Another important lesson is that forgiveness is not weakness. Many people believe forgiving means forgetting the pain or excusing the wrongs done to us. In reality, forgiveness is an act of courage. James did not forgive his father because the past suddenly became acceptable. He forgave because he refused to let the past destroy his future. Forgiveness allowed him to release the heavy burden he had carried for years and gave him the freedom to move forward with clarity and peace.
The story also teaches us that understanding often comes too late, when time has already taken much away from us. Illness, loss, and separation force people to confront truths they once avoided. In everyday life, we are often busy, stubborn, or silent, assuming there will always be another chance to speak, to explain, or to reconcile. This story reminds us not to wait until circumstances push us to the edge. Honest conversations and empathy should come before regret. Finally, Diep's presence shows that love is not about choosing sides, but about choosing what is right. She did not encourage revenge or blind obedience. Instead, she guided James toward balance between love for his father and respect for himself. True love supports growth, not destruction. In the end, life teaches us that healing begins when we choose understanding over pride, forgiveness over resentment, and love over fear.